In this video, I'm going to show you how you can transform any layers or selections that you have. Now, we're just going to be using one layer or one selection at this time, but keep in mind that this works for any type of selections that you make. So here we have mandala.psd, and this was a PNG file that I brought in, so you can see there's actually transparency in the background here. Now we can go ahead and we can fill in another background behind it just to make it a little easier to see. So let's just go ahead and create a new layer. We're going to put it underneath the mandala. Let's go ahead and call this one mandala, and we'll call this one background. And we'll go ahead and fill in a background color. Maybe we can pick kind of a, see how this looks. We'll fill that in with the foreground color. So I picked a color, foreground color, hit OK. And that might be a little dark. We can go to fill and just choose color. And the color picker tool will pick that color for us. Just want to brighten it up just a little bit here. Hit OK. Okay, that's pretty easy to see now. So let's click on the mandala layer, and you can give any background color that you wish. It doesn't matter. But we're going to pick the mandala, and we can make a selection and move any part of this. So for instance, if I grab the rectangular tool and I make a selection in the middle, and I go to edit, we're going to be looking at the transform tools here. Now I can go ahead and say rotate that selection, and that's going to allow me to rotate around the selection that I've made here. It's going to go ahead and highlight everything, but because it's being selected. But whenever I have what I like here, I just hit the enter button, and then I can deselect, and you can see we've rotated that square selection around that we made here. I'm going to go ahead and undo that, and I just want you to keep in mind that you can do that with any selections, but for right now we're going to actually just edit the whole layer. Because we have a transparent background, again, we can transform the whole layer as one whole piece. So if I have that layer selected and I go to edit and I go to transform and I rotate this, you'll see that it'll automatically select the confounds of the image that we have here, and this works really well. I don't have to worry about going in and making the perfect selection. It'll kind of do that for me, and now I can rotate this around however I would like to. Whenever I'm done, I can just hit enter, or if I don't like it, I can hit the escape button and it'll escape out for me. So let's take a look at all the transforms real quickly. We'll start at the bottom. First, we have the basic rotations and the flips that we saw with an image. So before, that was actually if you go to image and you go to image rotation, that's adjusting the whole canvas. But here, this is going to affect just your selection. So if I rotate 180, you're not going to see it because it's a mandala, but it'll basically rotate this around 180 degrees. Same thing with rotate 90 degrees and flipping horizontal and flipping vertical. You can do that with any selection you make, just so you can see it real quick. We'll make a selection, we'll go to transform, and we'll rotate 90 degrees, and it's rotated that image for us 90 degrees. And it looks kind of funny because of the way that a mandala works. Okay, so let's look at some of these other ones. First, we have scale. Scale is going to make an image bigger or smaller, so we can grab these handles and we can make this image bigger or smaller. If we hold shift, it will confine the aspect ratio so that this mandala stays nice and pretty. And if we hold the Alt or Option key while holding Shift, so Shift Alt or Shift Option, it'll do it from the center. And you find yourself using this a lot because you want to keep it in place, keep it where it's anchored, but also be able to scale it. Now, if we don't want that, we hit Escape, and it'll take us back to the original look here. The next one that we have is rotation, which we just looked at, but basically we're going to have these arrows that are curved, and by clicking and dragging we can rotate this around its anchor point. Now when we talk about the anchor point, we're talking about the point here in the middle. This can actually be moved. Currently it's centered to the image, and the rotation happens around this anchor point. If I move this anchor point, it's gonna, imagine that I took a nail and nailed it into the mandala. this is where it's going to rotate around from. So now you can see that we rotate around the anchor point, and all these transforms use that anchor point to figure out where it needs to transform from. So if I use that anchor point, I'm going to hit escape, and we go back to the scale and put in the center. Let's move it back to where it was. Now when we scale, it's not scaling from the center or from the bottom left. It's scaling from that actual anchor point. That is where the scale is happening. And if I were to use the Alt and Shift keys, it's actually scaling from that section. So you see it's offset, whereas before it was nice and centered. So the anchor point tells where all these transforms are going to happen. And it's really useful in the rotation because just like a car wheel or something, you might want to anchor it from the top, and then when you rotate, it works kind of like a hinge. So that's how the anchor points work with these transforms. Skew is going to allow us to just skew it vertically or horizontally. So we can grab these and we can move them in different ways. So we can skew them this way and this way. We'll undo that. Distort is going to allow us to distort from the corners. So where skew was kind of moving the sides horizontally and vertically, distort allows us to grab these corners and move them around to kind of give more of a 3D looking effect. We have perspective, and perspective is going to tie in two corners together to kind of give us a perspective as if, say, we were looking at a building and this was a bottom, that's the top. It gets smaller as it goes up. So you can use this to align things into perspective, or say we're looking down a street and this is the side of a building. So perspective does two corners at a time. Then we have warp. And what warp does is it allows us to grab any of these points, and they act kind of like anchor points, and you can push and pull them around. So if I grab this one here and I move it, you can see it's squashing and stretching and warping that image based on the way that I'm pulling it. And you can grab any of these and move them like that, and it will warp it for us. They all act as kind of individual anchor points. Now, something else that we have here is what's called again, and basically what's going to happen is just going to repeat the last thing you did. So if I hit scale and I move it down and hit enter, and then I go to edit, transform again, it's going to do the same scale at the same amount. So I can keep doing that. And you see the command here is Shift Control T or Shift Command T. And so it's going to keep scaling it down in increments based on the first one that I did. So it's just repeating that action over and over again. Finally, the last thing we have here is the free transform, Control T or Command T. You might find yourself using this often, so it's a good shortcut key to memorize. And it's giving us kind of access to all the different things. So based on the cursor, you can see I have the rotation icon here, but if I go here, we have the scale icon, and if I go to the corners, we have the scales. If I go in the center, I have the solid arrow, which lets us just move things around. I can do a number of transforms all in one go. So I can move it, and then I can scale it, and then I can rotate it, and that's the free transform tool. It lets us do all of those together. Now, if I hit Control T or Command T to bring the free transform up, you'll also see in the options bar at the top that we can manually punch this information in. So right now, this image, based on its anchor point and size, is sitting at 841 pixels by 960. And if you imagine that there's pixel dimensions going across this image, that is like the GPS of where this image is sitting. I can change this number by typing something in, but as with most tools in Photoshop, if I hover over the name and I see a double arrows, it means that I can click and drag. And when I click and drag these location values, you can see that it's moving where this is actually sitting. So now we're sitting at 1,539 pixels. And so the first two, the X and the Y, that is going to be our location. So we'll undo that, bring that back up again. We have those values, and then we can reset them back to 0 so we can say that this is 0 now. It makes it a little easier for us instead of trying to memorize all those numbers. Now say we want to translate this 20 pixels, we can just come in and hit 20. And so that allows us to set those numbers that way by being absolute or relative is what they call that. So we'll unselect that. The next one is a width and height. So this is going to be your scaling properties. Again, if I click and drag, you can see that we can scale this out. We can scale the width. We can scale the height. And we can lock these together so it keeps the aspect ratio. So now they're both 131%. And as I drag one, it drags the other. This is like holding Shift on the keyboard. You're locking those together. The next is we have rotation. That looks like this little triangle, geometry triangle here, and if we click and drag that, you can see the rotation happening. Then these next two are going to allow us to adjust the skew, so just like we were skewing before. And then we have the interpolation of the pixels. So this is just saying how do we want to interpolate the pixels as we get bending and warping them. And then finally, we actually have a warp tool. So we can click on that and it'll bring up those warp tools for us so we can begin warping right here. So that is all of the transform tools. Again, you can do that with any selection you make. So if I were to select just the center, and let's say that I wanted to rotate this, again, we can rotate around the selection that we made, but it's going to rotate around that anchor point. And if I move that anchor point, say up here to the top, this whole thing is going to rotate around that anchor point. So that's how the anchor points work, and that's how the transform tools work. I suggest you get in here and mess around with them because they're very useful and you'll probably find yourself using them a lot. So it's good to get comfortable with them now.